My name is Jake. And I need to confess something. Something I've kept buried inside for far too long. It's hard to even say out loud, but I can't carry this weight anymore. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more bold and unfiltered truths. It started innocently enough, after my mum passed away. I don't think anyone truly knows how to handle a loss like that. It's like the world just keeps turning, but you're stuck in a moment where everything feels wrong, and nothing makes sense. My dad, Simon, he was always strong, always the one to keep us grounded. But after Mum died, he fell apart in ways I never expected. I guess that's when Rachel entered the picture. She wasn't just some stranger. Rachel was Mum's gym trainer, someone who had been around us for years, always with a smile, always the picture of health and vitality. It felt like she was the one person who understood Dad's grief. They began spending more time together, after the funeral, after the mourning. I was happy for him, at first. I wanted him to be happy. But it wasn't just the way Rachel helped him pick up the pieces, it was the way she looked at him. The way she looked at me. In the beginning, it was subtle. Nothing obvious, at least not to anyone else. But I started to notice it. When she would laugh, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long, or when she touched my shoulder while she was talking. It made me uncomfortable. And it made me curious. But I told myself, it's nothing. She's just being kind. She's just helping us through this mess. I kept thinking that over and over, telling myself there was nothing more to it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then, one evening, something shifted. It wasn't a big moment, but it was enough to change everything. I was working on a project, and Rachel came over to help. She stood a little too close, reached over my shoulder a little too casually, and when her hand brushed mine, it felt like my heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake it. Something had changed. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling. Rachel wasn't supposed to be part of our family. At least, not in the way she ended up. She was Mum's gym trainer, always fit and energetic, always encouraging Dad to push himself harder. I had always thought of her as someone who was just there, you know? She was the woman who helped my mum with her fitness routine, nothing more. I didn't think much about her outside of that context. But after Mum passed, things changed. I didn't expect Rachel to become a regular part of our lives, let alone part of the fabric of our family. It started small, just a phone call here and there. Then Dad invited her to dinner one night, saying she'd been so supportive after Mum's death. I didn't think anything of it at first. Rachel was just helping him, right? But as time went on, I began to notice how often she was at our house. She'd come over to check on Dad, to see if he was okay, and before long, it wasn't just about helping him cope with grief. They started talking about their lives, their dreams, and I hated to admit it, but I felt like an outsider. Like they were building something I wasn't part of. And then one night, something happened. Dad and Rachel were sitting at the kitchen table, talking about something I didn't really care about. I should have been grateful that Dad was finally opening up, but all I could focus on was how she was sitting there, so close to him, her hand brushing his as she passed him something. It made my stomach churn. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that anyone else would have noticed. But it was enough to make me uncomfortable. Every little touch, every shared smile, it didn't feel right. I couldn't help it. I watched them. I watched the way they'd talk for hours, laughing and reminiscing about the past. The more time I spent with Rachel, the more I couldn't ignore the way I felt when she looked at me. She was warm, kind even, but there was something else there. Something that unsettled me. She was my stepmother. And yet, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I thought she was looking at me differently. And it messed with my head. I was angry at myself for feeling the way I did, but I couldn't stop it. Every time she was near me, I felt drawn to her. And every time I looked at Dad and Rachel together, I felt this sharp, painful twist in my chest. I wanted to be happy for Dad, for him to find someone to share his life with again. But in the back of my mind, there was this whisper telling me something wasn't right. I wasn't sure if it was the grief, the loneliness, or something more twisted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was somehow crossing a line. It happened one evening when I was working on a project for school, sitting in the living room and staring at a pile of unfinished work. I should have been focused on it, but my mind kept drifting, like it always did these days. I had this strange feeling, something in the air, a tension that seemed to build up every time Rachel was around. And that evening, she was. She came into the room while I was hunched over my books, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. I looked up briefly, half expecting her to say something about how I needed a break or that she'd made dinner. But instead, she just stood there for a moment, watching me. She smiled, her eyes warm, but there was something more. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I could feel it. "Need some help?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, almost coaxing. I nodded without thinking, not realizing that I'd just let her into my space in a way that felt different. I didn't want her to help, didn't want to feel anything. But she moved closer, pulling the chair beside mine and sitting down next to me. She reached over, pointing at my notes, but then she touched my shoulder. It was just a casual gesture, right? But her fingers lingered there a bit too long. Just for a second, but that second felt like an eternity. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel a heat rush up to my face. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem rude, but more than that, I didn't want the feeling to go away. Her touch was warm, soothing, and I felt this pull in my chest, something I shouldn't have been feeling. I tried to ignore it, tried to laugh it off and make a joke about being too absorbed in my work, but inside, I was spiraling. What was happening to me? Why did this feel so different? Was it the grief, or was there something else, something darker, more dangerous? She kept talking, but I barely heard her. I could only think about the way her fingers felt on my skin, how she seemed so comfortable sitting next to me, like this was all so natural. But it wasn't. It wasn't natural. Rachel was my stepmother. And the thought of what I was feeling, it made my stomach twist. I didn't know if it was wrong or if it was just a result of all the emotional chaos around me. But the more I tried to deny it, the stronger it became. When she stood up to leave, she gave me a quick smile, like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. But I knew something had. And I hated myself for it. I hated that I was starting to feel this way about her, because I knew it was wrong. But the seed was planted. And now, I couldn't stop it from growing. It's strange how quickly things can change. 1 minute, you're just going through the motions, trying to make sense of everything, and the next, you're tangled in feelings you can't control. A few days after that night with Rachel, I found myself watching her more and more. And it wasn't just because she was always around. It wasn't that simple. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to grab my jacket. The moment I stepped in, I froze. There they were, Rachel and Dad, sitting on the couch together, laughing at something on the TV. Her head tilted back as she laughed, her eyes sparkling with that genuine, carefree expression. It looked so normal. So right. But something about it, it set something off inside me. I don't even know why. I stood there for a moment, unnoticed, feeling my chest tighten. There was this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I could see them, both so comfortable with each other. Rachel, so at ease in my father's presence. Dad, so happy. She was everything Mum wasn't, everything I had never noticed before. She was beautiful, strong, confident. Her laughter was so contagious, so unrestrained. I shouldn't have been staring, I knew that. I should have turned around and walked out of the room like it was no big deal. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I just kept watching them, watching her. The way she tilted her head, the way her lips curved into that smile. And then, for a brief moment, she glanced at me. I quickly averted my gaze, feeling my face flush. But I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was changing. Something was growing inside of me, this gnawing, burning feeling that I couldn't shake. I tried to rationalize it, told myself it was just the grief. Maybe I was just lonely. Maybe it was just that the house felt so empty without Mum. Maybe it was the way Rachel was trying so hard to help us both heal. But no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, the unease in my chest only grew. The more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to pull me in. And the more I watched Rachel, the more I realized how little I knew about her. How much there was about her that I wanted to understand. But those thoughts were dangerous. I knew they were. Yet, every time I saw her laugh with Dad, every time I saw her smile at me, that forbidden pull became harder to ignore. I kept telling myself nothing inappropriate was happening. That I was just looking for something to fill the emptiness. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she spoke. The way she moved. How every touch, every glance, seemed to make my heart race in a way I couldn't control. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't help it. Rachel was my stepmother. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the fact that I was becoming obsessed. The more I tried to push these feelings away, the stronger they grew. It was late one evening when the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to settle deep into your bones. I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the weight of everything going on, or maybe it was just the stillness of the night that made me restless. Whatever it was, I found myself wandering into the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water or some time alone might clear my head. I didn't expect anyone else to be awake. But there she was, Rachel, standing by the counter, her back to me as she quietly stirred something in a bowl. The soft hum of the fridge was the only sound in the room. It felt like a dream, quiet, almost surreal. When she turned and saw me, her face softened. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice gentle but tired. I shook my head, unsure of how to answer. I was torn between wanting to talk to her and needing to get away before something happened. But Rachel didn't give me a chance to escape. She smiled faintly and poured me a glass of water, offering it with an easy grace. "I get it," she said quietly as I took the glass. "After everything that's happened, it's hard to relax, isn't it? I still feel like I'm in some kind of fog, trying to find my place in all this." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about how hard it must be for her, coming into our family like this. It wasn't easy for any of us, but I could see the struggle in her eyes. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability, not just as my stepmother, but as a woman. She sighed, her shoulders slumping as she set the bowl aside. "I never imagined it would be like this. I thought it would just fit. But I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove myself, to be the person everyone needs. And it's exhausting. I know your dad has his own grief to deal with, and I understand it, but sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly belong." Her words lingered in the air, and there was a rawness to them that I hadn't expected. Without thinking, I reached up to touch her arm, just a simple gesture of comfort, a way to show I understood. But when my hand met her skin, something inside me snapped. She froze for a second, her eyes widening as if she wasn't expecting me to touch her. And then, just like that, she let out a soft breath and turned her gaze toward me. Rachel placed her hand on my arm, her fingers curling gently around my skin. I could feel the heat of her touch spreading through me, sending an electric jolt straight to my chest. It was like nothing I had ever felt before, intense and suffocating. I looked at her, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. The space between us closed, and there was this magnetic pull I couldn't escape. I pulled back, my heart racing in my chest. I'm sorry," I stammered, immediately regretting the contact. She looked at me with an expression that was hard to read, a mix of surprise and something else. Something I couldn't place. She quickly withdrew her hand, almost like it was an accident. "It's okay, Jake. You're just trying to help," she said, though her voice sounded strained, as if she too felt the tension. I nodded, trying to push the moment out of my mind. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the strange, electric pull between us. I tried to convince myself it was just the late hour, the exhaustion from everything, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something more, something that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. As Rachel turned back to the counter, I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. What had just happened? Was I imagining things? Or had the tension between us always been there, just waiting to surface? I had no answers. All I knew was that it felt wrong, and yet, it felt like something I couldn't walk away from. I could hear her sigh softly, but I didn't turn around to look at her. Instead, I stepped quietly out of the kitchen and back into the darkened hallway. The unease in my chest grew heavier with each step. I couldn't tell if I was terrified or relieved. But either way, I knew one thing: I couldn't ignore this anymore. I woke up the next morning with a strange feeling still hanging over me, like a thick fog I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on the usual routines, breakfast, schoolwork, pretending everything was normal, but the weight of last night was heavy on my chest. The way Rachel's touch had lingered on my arm, the way her eyes met mine just for that fleeting second, it was all I could think about. I couldn't help but replay it over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself that it was just a moment of weakness, that maybe it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I felt guilty for something I hadn't even fully understood yet. I hadn't asked for these feelings. They just crept up on me, slowly, until I found myself looking at her in a way I shouldn't have. I couldn't stop myself from thinking about her, the way she moved, the sound of her voice when she spoke to me, how her presence seemed to fill every room we were in. It was maddening. But guilt is a funny thing, isn't it? It eats away at you, making you question everything you thought you knew. Was I wrong for feeling the way I did? Was it natural, or was it something darker that was slowly taking over? Maybe it was just a phase, some misplaced grief or some twisted form of admiration, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced when she was near. And that terrified me. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment I crossed the line. I just didn't realize it yet. I'd gone from seeing Rachel as my stepmother, someone who was there to help fill the void my mother left behind, to something far more complicated. It wasn't just about family anymore. It was about desire that was wrong, forbidden. Every part of me screamed to stop, to push those feelings away, to pretend it wasn't happening. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. This thing between us was real. I was crossing a line I didn't even fully understand, and I had no idea how much deeper it would take me. All I knew was that nothing felt simple anymore. My world, my family, everything was starting to unravel, and I was powerless to stop it. I was scared. Scared of what it meant, scared of how much I wanted it, and scared of the consequences that were waiting for me if I let this go any further. But part of me didn't want to stop. Part of me wanted to see where this would lead, even if it destroyed me in the process.